welcome everyone back. If this is your second time joining us for the second part of this two-part series, welcome back. If you weren't able to join us for the first session, welcome to our second part of our workshop that looks at strategic planning with a DEI focus. We are so thrilled to have you here and glad that you've taken some time out of your afternoon to talk about this important topic. So just a couple of housekeeping things before we get started. We are recording today's session. It will be on the ACCE webinar page after the session today, along with the slides. So with the slides and the recording, you'll be able to find that there. It will be with the first session as well. So if there's anything from that session you'd like to go back and listen to, you'll have access to both of those. We are offering this. So if you have colleagues that weren't able to attend and you'd like to send them this information, they will be able to access it as well. So please feel free to pass it along. We are expecting a large number of participants today. So just as we did with our first session, we do have everyone muted and you will not be able to take yourselves off mute. So during the Q&A portion of our session, if you'd like to just use the raise your hand feature, then one of us will unmute you so you can ask your question. We'll also be using the chat. So if you want to just type questions into the chat, then one of us will read those out loud as well. So either of those are appropriate, and however you'd like to interact, we welcome your questions and feedback throughout the session. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and reintroduce Kuma again for those of you who might have missed her introduction in our first session. We're so thrilled to have her presenting this series and delighted that she's here with us today. So Kuma currently serves as a consultant and vice president of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm reading the wrong bio. So just one moment, my apologies for that.
It's okay.
Make sure that we have the right one here. All right. Here we go. This one's the right one. So Kuma Roberts is the Senior Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Consultant for Arrowhead Consulting and has over 10 years of organizational development experience, specializing in the business case for diversity, equity, and inclusion, cultural competence, implicit bias, strategies for becoming an equity-centered organization, inclusive workplace language, as well as other elements of diversity, equity, and inclusion. As a graduate of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Institute for Organizational Management, she has spoken to hundreds of businesses, nonprofits, and chambers of commerce on the best practices for developing a strategic plan related to DEI. Kuma is passionate about racial and social justice, with emphasis on shifting policy and practice versus hearts and minds, and speaking to how more companies and organizations can harness the power of DEI to enhance their competitive advantage. When Kuma isn't speaking, she loves cooking for her husband, wrestling with her 3-year-old son, and arguing with her 16-year-old daughter. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and pass it over to Kuma.
Great. Thank you so much, Amy, for that amazing introduction. I always have to laugh when it talks about wrestle. I literally wrestle with him all the time, and I'm always arguing with my daughter. These are not half truths. These are the truths about who I am. I'm really excited you all have joined us again today, twice within a week. It's amazing that you're taking the time to be able to learn a little bit more about being an equity-centered organization and about how to infuse more equity into your strategic planning. We will spend a little bit of time, sorry, let me just get my clicker going here. We will spend a little bit of time moving into a little recap about what we learned last week. We'll talk about some shared language around D&I. We will talk about some systems of advantage. We'll move into the equity lens and what it means to use the equity lens. And then we won't talk so much about the intercultural development continuum, but we will talk about the awake to woke to work model and a little bit more about what that looks like for a Chamber of Commerce as you all begin to build your strategy. And then I'll end with some tips that I think would be really important that if you're overwhelmed by information that we're going to cover today in the next hour that we have together a little more, that there'll be 5 tips that you can leave with that will help you infuse more equity. Quickly, I just want to say just a word about Arrowhead Consulting. I am new to the consulting world. I was previously the Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the Tulsa Regional Chamber of Commerce. I did so much work with them, starting to talk to other chambers of commerce across the nation as we were sort of digging deep into our equity work, that I felt like I could best be served as a consultant, really able to help transform an organization as it relates to this work and not just sort of touch the surface as I only had capacity to do at the chamber. So Arrowhead is the company I've come to. It's a project management, leadership development, organizational effectiveness, and learning services company. And so we do a lot of training around emotional intelligence and project management, but I get to add the D&I, implicit bias, and all of the training that goes along with that for organizations looking to supercharge their efforts. So if you are indeed looking for consulting services, allow Arrowhead to help you in that way. We talked last week about the value of shared language, and that if we weren't clear on the words and ideas, how could we become clear on the solutions? So I just want to recap the value of that shared language. And so when I say diversity, when I'm talking about diversity, I'm talking about the unique characteristics, perspectives, and life experiences that define us all as individuals. Then we move into inclusion, which is about creating an environment where all individuals contribute fully and feel valued, engaged, and supported to reach their full potential. And then at the very bottom of this little seesaw, we have equity, which ultimately is the fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement of all individuals. And if you want to take it one step further, right in the center, that little fulcrum there is belonging. And that's really truly where the culmination of all three of those things, the diversity, the inclusion, and the equity, come together, and you have an employee, an organization where everyone feels like they belong. And so I wanted to create that shared language. It's important that we do that so that when I use these terms, you know what I mean. And we're going to take just another moment to dig a little bit deeper into diversity and what I think it means. And we're not just talking about race. Race is something that I talk about extensively. I do talk about race a lot, and we will talk about race a lot, but it's not something I talk about it exclusively. There are a variety of elements related to diversity and inclusion that I want us to factor into this work. Race and ethnicity is one, but ability is another one. Last week, we talked about how ability is the only minority group any one of us could enter at any time. So we need to be thinking about those individuals with disabilities as we have more and more conversations around equity. We need to think about age and how important that is to our workforces and our chambers and our communities. Of course, if we're not thinking about our veterans and our LGBTQ+, and then more importantly and ever growing is the need for us to think about solutions for our immigrant and refugee populations as we think about diversity. So again, race, yes, it's very good and absolutely has to be a core piece of how you address your strategy to infusing more equity in your organization. But there are a lot of other elements that you can also be thinking about as it relates to DEI. You know, last week we talked about equity being aspirational, that ultimately improved conditions and outcomes for marginalized people, plus increased power to determine and sustain those improvements, ultimately means greater integration, interaction, and interdependence across identities. So it's aspirational for us to think about including more equity into our strategies and into our organizations. But equity is also operational. It's about interrupting inequitable practices, examining your own biases, and creating inclusive environments for all individuals, especially those who've been historically marginalized. And that's not just communities of color. Again, all of those different identities that I mentioned earlier can also benefit from having more equity infused to your organization. Equity is a proactive approach to making systems work more fairly and ultimately producing results that people can tangibly feel in their lives. And so, you know, I still get the question, why is equity so hard to understand? I don't get it. What does it all mean? Well, again, in this picture, you know, we talked about the image that I think we most often see, which is the boxes of people sort of standing in a gate, and they're given different size boxes so that they can all see over the fence. I think this visual is much better to explain equity because it's about giving individuals the right tool or the right environment needed for their success. So as we look at this picture and we see that equality is about just giving everyone a bike, and equity is about giving everyone a bike that actually suits and best fits them for them to finish, to reach the finish line. So it's not just about giving everyone a shoe, that's equality. It's about equity, it's giving them a shoe that fits, okay? So I want you all to use your chat during this conversation. And if you have questions, I really want to take the time during this session to stop, answer those questions, and move through this presentation, because I do realize it's a lot of content. So Amy and Emily, you guys help me with that as we move forward, and in case there are questions that I need to address. I left you all with this quote last time about an equitable society. And ultimately, an equitable society is one in which the distribution of benefits and burdens is not determined or predictable or disproportionate by identity or place. And so that's no matter where you live, no matter how you identify, that you have equal access or equitable access to achieving your best self. And so that's what we want when we talk about equity and infusing more equity into our strategic plans. So let's talk a little bit about structural inequity. And this is a larger concept which shows here it's the cumulative impact of disparities in power over time. So much about this work around infusing more equity is about addressing the structural inequity that exists in our organizations, in our cities, in our communities, and largely in our nation. And so I want you all to think about structural inequity, and we're going to move through the awake to work to woke format so that you can better get a sense of how to address some of these inequities. But I do want to get into the equity lens. As we talk about equity and what it means and the difference between equity and equality and having the shoe that fits, not just the shoe, we want to get into what kinds of questions you might be asking when you're utilizing the equity lens in your work as you are developing your strategy. So this image was one that really resonated with me. And the title is How is Structural Racism Operating? But you could easily change this to how is structural inequity operating in your chamber, in your community, in your city? So here are some of the questions. How are resources designed, distributed, and controlled? When you're using the equity lens, you're starting to ask these types of questions in your organization in order to shift toward more equitable outcomes. What rules are currently in place, and who benefits from those rules, and who do those rules burden? Again, a really interesting question that we all need to be asking ourselves as we're using the equity lens. What stories are you telling? Are you only telling them from one side? Last night I did a presentation for the Tulsa Foundation for Architecture. And what they said to me was, we tell stories about white men who built big buildings in Tulsa, 100 years ago. How do we tell more diverse stories? How do we get access to more diverse stories about this city? And so I love that they were asking about the stories they were telling and who's telling them and how can they be more diverse and equitable in that. And then lastly, what people are directly impacted and what is their voice and who has the authority or influence and what actions are they taking? So when you see ultimately that structural inequity is operating under the surface by resources or inequity in resources, the rules, the people, the stories, and the history, what you're going to get are a lot of weeds, a lot of negative outcomes, and ultimately just a ton of disparity. That's why we're seeing a ton of disparity across education, across health, across economic development in our communities of color and other marginalized communities. And so we have to begin to ask ourselves these questions. What I want you all to think about largely is, how can equity take root in your organizations? And the questions related to that are, what resources could be available, accessible, and relevant to the needs of the people that need them the most? What programs are you offering within your chamber that truly makes your chamber more accessible, more available, and more relevant to more kinds of people? what rules could be fair to everyone and right past wrongs, right? For us, we have a large racial inequity in Tulsa. We have a city divided literally by a highway and by a railroad track. So our chamber began to think about, why are we always meeting on one side of town versus the other side of town? How can we partner more with other chambers across difference? Who suffers when we don't partner and collaborate better in terms of discussing economic development and our own legislative strategies for leading our city? So these are all questions that we began to ask ourselves. And then as well, what stories would more accurately convey and support the full humanity of individuals? And then how could people with authority and influence be more reflective and accountable to those who are directly impacted? And so again, when you look at the picture, you're seeing all of those same sort of impacts down underneath the surface, the resources, the people, and the rules, but ultimately what it creates is parity, where you have more positive outcomes and more positive experiences when you're asking questions about how racial equity and how equity can take root within your organization. Any questions about that? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just share a little bit, a document from the chamber itself. We utilized a document by the Ann E. Casey Foundation, and it really lined out the Race, Equity, and Inclusion Action Guide is what it was called. And we took pieces of that and used concepts shown within that Race Equity Guide and used it to form our own guide that we use not only with our staff, but with our board and with our volunteers within the organization. And it talks about, in order to fulfill our mission about improving the regional prosperity and the economic prosperity for our community, that we have had to evaluate our own policies and practices and decisions through a race equity lens. And in understanding that, we wanted to, again, create shared language around equity and around inclusion and diversity and racial justice. So we sort of came up with definitions that we thought would fit our organization. And so our board, we had an advisory council that came together, that we workshopped a lot of these definitions for our community and came up with equity as a definition. The concept of equity is synonymous with fairness and justice. It's helpful to think of it not only as a desired state of affairs or a lofty value, but it's something to be achieved and sustained. We defined equality, that in contrast, it aims to ensure that everyone gets the same things to enjoy a full, healthy life. We really had a lot of robust discussion about inclusion, that it was more than just diversity and numerical representation in our organization. Inclusion was about the authentic and empowered participation of individuals within our organization. And then we really wanted to do something that was fairly unique and name racial justice as something that was important to our organization. And racial justice was the systemic fair treatment of people of all races that results in equitable opportunities for everyone so that all people can achieve their full potential. And it goes on to talk about a lot more. I can't tell you how wonderful it was to just decide as a group to just come together and create these core concepts for our organization. What it meant for us when we use language like racial justice, when we talk about equity and equality, and for everyone to be on the same page, for me to come to our board meeting and be able to talk about these concepts and everyone understand exactly what I meant. And then again, we're all using the racial equity lens. It's pretty empowering to think about creating that shared language with your teams. We went further using the Annie Casey Equity Guide and created this key questions, so that if you were going to serve on our board, if you were going to be a volunteer and work any of our events and or lead any of our committees or sub-councils, we wanted you to think about these questions as you were developing your strategies. And so how could we be more collaborative? How would our proposed policy or practice or decision, again, again, affect or be perceived by people of different racial groups? This is just a simple question that we would put on a kind of like a boilerplate on top of our agendas as things to think about as we're leading our meetings. It's as simple as you to basically do the same thing as you all are trying to get your board, your own staff, your own leaders to create and leverage the equity lens. How are all affected groups represented, and are they represented in the decision-making process? You know, this was something that we had to think about because a few years ago, there was a pretty damning article that came out in The Guardian about why America's Black people are leaving the heartland. It was a shocking article that sort of swept through our community. It was written by a Tulsan. His name is Caleb Gale. And he said, you know, as I look at the Tulsa Regional Chamber's steering committee and economic development committee and board of directors, I don't see a single person on there that looks like me. How can I believe that they care about an outcome for equity for my community if I don't see anyone represented in the decision-making process? So had we had this equity guide, that would have been a question as we were developing our Tulsa's future and all of our other strategies. We would have been able to ask the question, are the groups that we're trying to help and improve their outcomes, are they a part of our decision-making process? And then lastly, the question, we're talking about collaboration, is how can diverse communities and leaders engage from the outset to meaningfully shape solutions and strategies? So as we begin talking about the needs of the Black community, for instance, because that's a really crucial need here, you know, how can we engage with them from the beginning and infuse that very need into our work? And so we did have some focus groups at the Tulsa Regional Chamber. And ultimately, one strategy that came from that, from us hearing that there is a need for more capital, more access to networks for entrepreneurs of color, more resources, you know, all the same things I'm sure your cities are finding that they need to engage better with the African-American community. We created a strategic initiative that says we are going to support systems that improve economic access and mobility for communities of color. What does that mean? We're going to foster entrepreneur incubators. We're going to partner with our banks to improve seed funding and more access to funding. We're going to create and help support small retail and the Main Street opportunities for our North Tulsa community. These were some of the strategies that we put into our strategic plan that ultimately are showing up and are why we believe that we are becoming a more equity-centered organization. Then you move into the comprehensive, right? Who is facing racial barriers or bias or exclusion from power related to these issues? You know, and here in Tulsa and in Oklahoma, we have a large Native population. And so as we think about water rights issues, and as we're advocating and legislating for water, the Native population has a huge say in that. Or are we engaging with them properly in order to have these conversations and help guide our decisions as we seek our legislators to make decisions related to that? What are those questions for your community that you can ask that are more comprehensive, that suits the needs of your community? What are the potential unintended consequences of the suggested course of action? This is a huge question that we don't ever think about. We just start thinking from our own lens, which we know is fairly, homogenous in how we're thinking. We're not thinking about the unintended consequences of our suggested courses of action. So as you're developing your strategic plan, the question is, who might be negatively impacted by this? How are we making a situation worse by going down this plan? It's just a question to ask yourself that ultimately will lead you toward more equity in your organization. And then what course of action would foster through systemic change and would advance the most equitable solution for your organization? And again, the answers are broad. Who knows what that answer would be for your community? Again, what I love about this is it just provides the framework of questions that you can begin to ask yourself. And then it starts to get into the contextual, like what social conditions or determinants contribute to the challenge? What can be learned from prior efforts that you might have tried in the past programmatically, or other partnerships that didn't work or did work well and are still working well in your community? does the policy or practice or decision worsen or ignore existing disparity as it relates to health, education, and other issues within your community? And in what ways are affected stakeholders already involved in the issue, and how can their efforts be supported, integrated, or expanded? And that speaks a lot to getting people of color or marginalized communities at the table and lending their voice to help you all source solutions to adding more equity to your organizations. Again, none of this was something that I created. This was resources that are found on the internet. It's the Annie Casey guide, and it's notated here, and the slides will be available. You guys definitely take a look and use that framework to think about your own organization. What all of that work did was lead the Tulsa Regional Chamber to creating equity actions. Now we have equity actions for year 1, 2, and 3 of the remaining years left on our strategic plan. But this year, this is what led up. These are the actions that we decided we would take relating to equity. The first one is we have a one voice process. Many of your chambers probably do, where you're sort of advocating with your municipalities and with your state legislature to guide policy and practice. And for us, we wanted to make sure that we trained and prepared all of our one voice task chairs and our staff to understand and utilize the equity lens. So we very much went through the process that we were just talking about with each and every volunteer and individual in hopes that they would begin to ask those questions as they were leading our task forces around environment, transportation, education, HR, and workforce, so that they are creating the equity lens and using it actively in our processes. The next one was identify and promote the appropriate data that reflect the proposed one voice statement's impact on communities of color and marginalized populations. So not only did we want to have the questions in our closed door meetings, our task forces about what we were trying to do, we wanted to be very transparent in that what the data would do. Like if we made this choice related to a one voice statement, how does that impact that community or marginalized population? And we wanted to talk about the benefits ultimately of what that decision would be. And we wanted to be very transparent. So as a part of our legislative guide, we have stats and facts and figures related to each of those communities and how they're impacted by the decision and the stance our chamber decided to take. We also wanted to infuse equity across our economic development plan. So we talked a lot about during our request for proposal or our pitch efforts and site visits, that all materials include our chamber's commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then upon securing new companies or anyone looking to relocate to our city, we wanted to encourage them to complete our Mosaic Index to assess, promote, and advocate, and even learn from their commitment to D&I, because these organizations and new companies coming to your cities have their own values and practices, and many of them are doing very well in this space. How can you take and leverage that business's approach to D&I and infuse that into your chamber in order to make it more equitable? We thought that would be important, and so that's how we infuse that into our economic development strategies. In addition to this, and this is the one that was so important for me, was that we added a D&I commitment statement to our board expectations. So if you're going to even serve on the board at the Tulsa Regional Chamber, you have to do at least 1 hour of chamber-led D&I training and other board development opportunities during your service to the board. And that's every year. So we would often host implicit bias, cultural competence. We did a day of racial healing, all of these types of events to help continue to educate and make aware our board members about issues related to D&I. And then lastly, this was something that was a priority for our chairs. In fact, our chairs the last 3 years was they wanted to host leaders and individuals across difference in their home or other intimate setting to establish more relationships beyond our sphere of influence. You know, I talked last week about how diverse is our universe. Our universes are very small. And so it was very important that our leaders, our board chair, decided to reach out and meet with youth, with veterans, with people across ability status, LGBT members, come together to have conversations where they put feet under table, ask hard questions. How can we better serve you? And I think that will also go a long way toward infusing more equity. Again, this is just a small section of some of the things our chamber did to infuse equity, but we use this model that I'm going to walk through a little bit more in depth with you right now. It's called equity in the center. And this is how organizations can cycle through the race equity circle. And I love this because it's about race equity, but I think it works for any marginalized community. It takes your organization from awake. Awake is where organizations are focused strictly on representation or increasing numbers of racially diverse people. And there's no shame in being awake. That's a great place to be in. But it moves you then into woke, where organizations are evolving their culture to begin to value all people's contribution. Dare I say the inclusion part is probably a part of the woke model. And then ultimately we're getting to work, where organizations are accountable to addressing systemic inequity and the root causes of inequity, both internal and externally within your organization. As you can see, there are a very large number of levers that this model infuses to do this racial equity transformation work. It has levers that require senior leaders to do certain things and ask certain questions. There's a data lever. There's an organizational culture lever. There's a learning environment. There's a board of directors lever. There's a community lever. And then lastly, there's a manager's level. Today, we're going to talk through just 3 of those levers and what it looks like to be awake, woke, and to work in those 3 areas. And I think this really will help bring home opportunities for you all to think more about becoming an equity-centered organization. As I mentioned before, a wake stage is where organizations are focused on people and on building a workforce and board comprised of individuals across difference. And that's fantastic. Everyone has to start somewhere. The primary goal when you're awake is simply representation, with an effort aimed at increasing the number of different races and backgrounds on your board, within your membership, and otherwise. When we talk about the woke stage, organizations are talking about culture and on creating an environment where everyone is comfortable sharing their experiences. And trust me, you can have an organization that is diverse, but maybe not inclusive to the point where everyone wants to feel comfortable talking about their race experiences or are equipped to talk about race and equity or inequities within the organization. So when you're woke, the primary goal is inclusion and internal change of behavior, policies, and practices. And I think something that we're all still striving to get to is that work stage, again, where organizations are focused on systems to improve equity, period, across all elements of your community. And the goal is using that lens in all aspects of your organization, whether it be tourism, whether it be economic development, whether it be your own hiring and organizational practices. You really want to address the internal and external systems of change and regularly administer race equity assessments to evaluate processes, programs, and operations. So here are the role of the levers in building, and I like to say, an equity culture. It doesn't even have to be a race equity culture. Senior leaders are really key in sort of developing an equity culture. And so you really want to tailor these conversations to senior leaders and individuals in any formal leadership role within your organization. You also want to tailor these conversations to managers or individuals who oversee operations of teams, because when they are more aware and equipped to have these conversations, they are looking at their teams through an equity lens, and ultimately they'll begin to see the benefit and the value of thinking in this way and using this lens. Of course, your board, it's a no-brainer. The governing body of your organization should be leveraging and thinking about equity. And also the community, who are the populations being served by your organization? Who's missing in terms of who you'd like to serve better? Those are the questions asked by that lever. Then there's the learning environment, and that's the investment in staff capacity. How are you training and developing your staff? How often are they going through implicit bias training? How often are they thinking about cultural competence and what that means? And then there's data, where you're addressing the metrics to drive improvements and sort of laser focus in on what needles you want to move within your community and within your organization. And then lastly, the last lever is organizational culture. Remember, we talked about the iceberg last time, and all those things underneath the surface are how we say our organization gets work done. We want it to be the truth about how we do our work. And so this framework talks about the organizational culture and how you do your work. So when you're looking at the board of directors lever and you're awake, you are looking at the personal beliefs and behaviors, you're looking at the policies and processes, and you're looking at some data related to your board. So on a personal belief and behavior standpoint, sometimes there are board members who aren't comfortable discussing issues tied to race and or equity at the board level. And I encounter that all the time when I'm asked to come in and talk to boards about diversity. In fact, last night I did an organization here in Tulsa where the board chair at the last minute couldn't make the presentation, but the rest of the board was very present. And what I heard after the fact was that's typical. He's not someone who's really bought in on the concepts of diversity, equity, inclusion. So when you're awake, perhaps you have individuals who are still not ready to talk about it. Again, some policies and practices in the wake model are you're starting to seek individuals from various racial backgrounds for your board, perhaps for positions or CEO or leadership positions in your organization. And then again, you have limited understanding from a data perspective about disparity in your populations, which might be served by your organization. For us, it was really important for us to understand how many women are in leadership across our city. What's the unemployment rate for African Americans versus white people? How many people of color do we have in our CEO positions? Why can't we source people for our board at that level? Because there's not enough of them in that position in Tulsa, Oklahoma. So these are some of the conversations and what your organization looks like when you're in the awake stage around thinking about equity. When you're moving into woke, you're starting to, from a personal belief and behavior standpoint, create and sustain practices to foster that inclusive environment, something that's going to encourage and value differing viewpoints. And from a policy and processes standpoint, you are evaluating your board membership requirements and you're ignoring systemic racial inequities and that reinforce dominant culture, such as minimum donation amounts. How many of us have those to serve on boards, right? Think about that. How does that create barriers and challenges for individuals across difference who might have a great seat at the table, but for some unrealistic minimum donation or conventionally prestigious backgrounds or requirements that we have in order to participate in our organization. And then data, you want to analyze disaggregated data to really identify the root causes of some of the disparities that are impacting some of your programs. You know, what time are you having your events? Where are you having your events? Some of those things might become questions related to a board that is really looking to move into the woke stage of equity within your organization. And then when you're getting to work, when you have a board of directors that is really thriving and moving into the sustainable, then you are leading internal processes, procedures, and culture that actively and consistently eliminate bias and disparity within your organization. And your board then, from a policy practice standpoint, starts to show a willingness to review organizational oppression, have some really hard conversations about why there aren't more Black people in leadership, why there aren't more people across difference involved in your organization. And then data begins to hold individuals accountable, right? You start saying, well, you know, in order to be a whole and very well-rounded leader in our organization, you're going to embrace these concepts, not only for your organization, but for ours. And people will really start to see that there's an expectation that they have to live up to in order to be a part of your organization as it relates to equity. Those are the 3 phases for the board of directors level. And I'm running through them really fast, so I do apologize. We will have time for questions. And again, this is a model that is online. I just feel like this is a very tangible framework for organizations looking to supercharge their board of directors in terms of doing more equity work. The next lever that I thought would be really important to cover with you all is the community lever. The community lever talks about the value of the community, the population you're serving, and the belief that they are all worthy partnerships and worthy of your investment. So oftentimes, you might have a minority or ethnic chamber operating in your community. Are you as invested in them as they are in your organization? Do you have a integral membership with them, an interchangeable membership, so that they can participate in your events and you participate in those? These are some of the questions and thoughts that you're thinking about supercharging equity within your community. These are questions you need to ask yourself. Are you encouraging your staff to volunteer time in the community? When you're awake and you're thinking about equity, you are giving your staff time to think about that. We have in Tulsa marched with our MLK parade year over year over year. And maybe we haven't marched. Some years we might just set up a booth and offer hot chocolate and donuts for those who are participating. But the point was our staff was always present. We had the day off, but it was strongly encouraged by our leadership that we are involved in things like that, where our faces are seen in communities across difference. We march in the Pride Parade. We engage in the Native history and Native American culture days here. And so you all can do the same thing. And then use data analysis to assess the racial impact of the work that you're doing on the communities you serve. And so that's when you're in the awake phase. When you're woke, you're starting to regularly seek community input on programs and services that you want to provide or that you intend to provide to the community. And then when you're talking about policies and practices, you have community representation already at the board level, on the board itself, or through perhaps a community advisory board. I always said I can't snap my fingers and diversify the Tulsa Regional Chamber board, overnight, but we can create an advisory council meant to sort of address some of the topics at hand. We are we are commemorating the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre this year. And so we had a small advisory council of individuals from the African-American community to come together and again, talk about what economic development means. What does reparations mean? And we didn't flinch from the word reparation. So these are some of the conversations you all can have at the community level that would indicate that you are ready to move into woke. And then from a data standpoint, you can disaggregate data to adjust programming and educational goals to keep pace with the changing needs of the community. So do you have measurement on how many Latinx individuals you want to participate in your organizations? How many partnerships do you want to cultivate with others across difference? These are some of the data points that you can bring in and infuse into your organization as you're thinking about more equity. And then lastly, we all want to get into work, where we are using the community lever where there's just the expectation that staff is going to work with community to co-create. I love the word co-create solutions to problems as a key way to meet your organization's needs and mission. And where you're going to, from a policy standpoint, define criteria and processes for maybe even grant awards or partner selection. There's an organization here in Tulsa that when you want money from them, a foundation, there's a very strict, do you align with our commitment to D&I? Because we want to give money to organizations that align with our thinking on diversity, equity, inclusion. Be bold and create that commitment, because when you show that, other people are going to want to sign on to your chamber. They're going to want to align themselves with an organization that has this mindset. So it's important to do that. And there are a ton of benefits that come from something like that. And then measure improvement using that baseline data to see if the program solutions are actually having a positive impact. So over the course of a year, benchmark, get some baseline data, but then reevaluate later. Did that program work? Are we still online? Are we increasing our numbers of diverse members? Are we increasing donorship as we make our alignment and commitment to diversity more known? I think those are things that will be valuable in the community lever. And then the lever that everyone wants to talk about is data, right? Data. How do we figure out data? When you're in the awake stage of the data level, you are believing that successful diversity means simply increasing the number of racially diverse people. And so that's easy. You can start to track that. And from a policy and processes fact, you're focusing on the number of employees hired at your chamber, retained by your chamber. Some people don't even measure how many are retained or how many are leaving. Do you do exit interviews? How are you capturing how many people are leaving your organization? Why are your members across difference leaving? It might be valuable to do some exit interviews to ask maybe what was missing from what you were offering them in terms of your program. And then track interventions from HR and other parties that mediate conflicts or misunderstanding based on some of those differences. So that can be a hard conversation, but really not flinching and just moving head on into a conversation about what happened, how can we improve our relationship? Here's what we're willing to do in order to make this better. We'd love to partner with you. There's a lot of conversation that can be had on the data lever to improve your equity. But when you're moving into woke, you want to support the implementation of new ways to measure initiatives, programs, and internal processes. And then you want to think about measuring job satisfaction, retention, and function by level and team. And then similarly, you want to disaggregate data by demographics in every policy and program that you measure. And then track your diversity suppliers, for instance. How many vendors are you using that might be diverse individuals? Are you partnering with your city on MBE programs, minority business entrepreneurs? And are you starting to track and publish some of the data that you're finding? That transparency will be really important. Every year, the Tulsa Regional Chamber does the inclusion report, and we promote and are very transparent in how much work we have to do in terms of leadership buy-in, policy and practice, recruitment. We issue the survey across our membership and ask them to take it, and that's how we get a sense of where we stand from the data lever. It's not always pretty data, but we find that it's important to share it across our community so that people get a sense that we are moving the needle, and we have seen improvements in several areas over the years. And then lastly, when you're in the work stage, you are using data proactively. You are assessing alignment between strategy metrics and equity values. And then you are using race equity data by using quantitative and qualitative and holding your organization accountable to improve impact. And again, these are big words, quantitative and qualitative data. But the point is that you're going to get even more laser focused each layer you go down to when you get to work. And so again, many of us aren't there yet, but this is kind of ultimately what it looks like for our organizations as you include the board, the community, and the data lever into your work. So I'm going to go through the success steps. There are 5 steps for success, which are pretty clear. I've talked about them, but I just want to make really simple for those of you that kind of heard all of that or thinking about how to overlay that in your strategic planning. I want to go through these 5 steps so that if you leave with nothing, you leave with these in order to infuse more equity into your organization. The first one is really important. Without the value of shared vocabulary for talking about diversity and inclusion, you're not going to get anywhere fast. Everyone has a different viewpoint on what it means. Some people think equity is a handout, it's affirmative action. It means people have misunderstandings about all these things mean. When you and your organization, your chamber can come together to talk about and establish that shared vocabulary, it grounds your organization. Those terms work hand in hand in achieving equity, and it will ultimately help you dismantle the inequities that you see in your organization. Many organizations create sort of a running dictionary of terms. As you could see, we had some core concepts in our equity guide. What does race equity mean? What does inclusion mean? What does diversity mean? You all should do the very same for your community and for your organization. It will be very helpful as you move forward. The next one is identify your equity champions at your board and leadership levels of your organization. You know, chamber speak is put a volunteer between yourself and a problem. And so I'd always have all of these thoughts around how to make our organization more equitable, but it was made easier because I had champions at our board level and in our leadership level that I could go to and say, here's what I'm trying to do. Here's the barrier I think we need to address. And those champions helped push some of those initiatives forward, and I didn't have to do the work. It's not the work of the person of color in your organization to move these big molehills. It's really the work of everyone to be a champion, but certainly our leaders and our CEOs and our board chairs should be those champions. And I just have to brag, for the past 3 years straight, diversity, equity, inclusion has been a top priority, top 3 priority for all past year board chairs. And that's pretty incredible for them to name that. And we expect that it will be a priority for every board chair moving forward. The next one is name equity as a strategic imperative for your organization. So it's great to say diversity. Yes, diversity should be strategic and it should be an imperative. Yes, inclusion and inclusive outcome and inclusive culture should be a part of your organization. But I would challenge you to be bold and name equity as a part of your organization. Define and communicate how equity works to help your organization achieve its mission. The more you connect the reasons for doing this work to your mission, your vision, your values, and your strategies, the more vital it will feel as a part of your organization at every level. So definitely name it as a strategic imperative. Like I said, we had 2 strategic initiatives related to equity in our strategic plan. It was increase economic access and mobility for communities of color and marginalized communities, and then lead, leverage, and educate the business community on the value of D&I as a competitive advantage. The next one is create opportunities for continuous dialogue around your commitment to equity. Host a day of understanding, host implicit bias, community-wide implicit bias training, offer your members an opportunity to educate themselves, best practices. There are local experts within your own community who can come in and talk about these things. Creating that continuous dialogue allows people to recognize that it's always going to be there. You're the hub, you're the resource for this information, and they're going to want to expand that knowledge to their employees, to themselves, and it creates people from flinching when it comes down the pike. Oh, we're going to talk about diversity again. When it's continuous, when you keep infusing it into how you talk about your strategies and your work, people will come to expect that that's a part of actually your organization, and they're going to want to do more work with you and engage with you more. And then lastly, disaggregate your data. I really can't say that enough. It's the only bullet point. Start looking at your numbers. The only way to get a clear picture of inequity and outcome gaps, both internally and externally in your chamber, is to collect, disaggregate, and report relevant data. And again, I think we as chambers have this, we have to put the sunny spin on everything. Things look good, our city's good, everything's great. But I think we know that at the core, there's a ton of disparity. So anytime you can partner to be transparent about what that disparity is. I remember going to, I believe it was Minneapolis, and they have like a dashboard or a scorecard that really talks about economic opportunities, retention of people across color. It was just kind of the scoreboard related to D&I that was pretty shocking to see in paper, because some of the numbers weren't impressive, but they knew their numbers and they knew when they were making difference, and they were instituting programs and practices that helped move the needle so they could tell a better story year over year to how they'd move the needle. You should always think about examining staff engagement, performance, compensation data, and encourage your members to do the same. Ultimately, you want your community, your business community, to be much more inclusive and equitable, and then hold your organization from the top to bottom accountable for this work. So that is the very fast equity conversation that I wanted to have with you all today about infusing equity in your organization. But this quote I thought was a really great one to end on, and then I want to spend a lot of time taking some questions. Creating positive change is really no simple task, but no matter who you are and no matter where you are, you absolutely can. So if you don't take away anything else, a board lever, community lever, a data lever, those 5 steps alone, just doing those things, establishing the shared vocabulary, identifying and naming race equity or equity as an imperative, opening that continuous dialogue and disaggregating data, those are the things that are going to set your organization forward so that you're truly leading with equity. And that's my presentation. I would love to take any questions anyone has. Will you moderate for me, Amy?
I'd be happy to do that. So again, if you want to drop your questions into the chat, you can do that. If you'd like to raise your hand, we will enable it so that you can unmute yourself and you can ask your question directly to Kuma. So we'll just give folks a moment to either raise their hands or put some questions into the chat here.
Hopefully there's some questions. Is everyone overwhelmed? I see a lot of familiar faces. Is anyone doing this work in their organization or thinking about equity versus diversity and inclusion, or only diversity and inclusion? Let me ask you all some questions. There's one raised hand.
Yeah, I see Pammy's hand up. So
thank you, Pammy.
Should be able to unmute yourself now.
So thank you, ladies. So Kuma, outstanding. I've enjoyed both of the sessions. Thank you so much for this.
Sure.
We're in the beginning stages in Huntsville, doing this right now.
Okay.
We have a D&I, I would call it a task force right now.
Great.
It is led by an individual on our executive committee. So they're doing the work now. But the question I wanted to ask was, what did your language, what I would be interested in seeing was your state and federal agenda. Like, you know, because there's a thin line there when you get into the political component of it.
Yeah.
So I'm interested to see what you all's language looked like when you were doing your state and federal agendas, because I know this should be in the state and federal agendas, and how much of it. So it's just interesting to hear your take on that.
Yeah, so we approved and passed our equity actions and our equity guide through our board in October of 2020. So we've always done a legislative agenda. I think a lot of chambers do. But so this year will be the year that they will be being more transparent about the data and how communities are impacted as a result of that. So everyone's been trained on the equity lens. Everyone understands the questions to be asked. So when they go through that one voice process, and we have a variety of task force meetings related to, like I said, economic development, transportation, all of these different areas, then they will be using that equity lens and creating the one voice, using that this year. So I wish I had something. Certainly our one voice agendas are listed there, and they weren't bad. They weren't inequitable. I don't want to say that. I just felt like we could be a lot more transparent with why we were making the decisions we were making. It's sort of said as fact, this is our legislative agenda. These are the things our chamber is supporting, but we weren't exactly saying why we are supporting those and the impact, what we believe the benefit of would be to the communities or marginalized population. So Pammy, I don't have an exact example of that particular thing for you. We'll be looking for that this year for sure. They'll be putting that out probably starting in June. They'll start their task force meetings, and the finished product will be more the end of the year.
Great. I'm going to bounce between some questions in the chat and folks that have their hands raised.
Sure.
So in the chat, we have a question from Glinda, and she says, I'm in the process of developing a DEI plan. Did you have an assessment tool that you used for staff?
For staff?
Yes.
Yeah, so you can go visit mosaic-tulsa.com and then go to the Mosaic Index. There, the questions for 2020 and 2019 are there. That would probably be a great starting place. I've also looked at PricewaterhouseCoopers has a great assessment for staff and some other ones, but it talks about, do you believe your leadership is bought into D&I? How is it demonstrated? Do you see them actively using this language in staff meetings? There's like a little bit of some questions that you could probably pick and choose that might make a great pulse check or survey for staff related to the perceptions around what they currently think about your efforts toward D&I. That might be a great starting place. So mosaic-tulsa.com and check out the index, and you can just print the PDF of the questions and use those. That might be a great way to help you get started in that respect.
Great. So our next question is from Taylor. What advice would you have for an organization to look inward as they're also starting a community-wide DEI program?
Yeah, so it was really important for me at the Tulsa Regional Chamber that we practice what we were preaching. We had always had Mosaic since 2011. It was founded. It was very, we would say it's our external facing coalition of partners and members who believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion, but not necessarily, I didn't believe that we were aligned on the inside of our organization as a result of that. So when you're looking inward, I would make sure that what a wonderful thing to say that our board was 100% trained in implicit bias. Wouldn't it be fantastic if you could say that everyone has an understanding about the equity lens, or we all are reading this one book. Maybe we're reading White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo together so that we can have a larger community conversation about it. I mean, there's just little things that you can do that I think would help increase the awareness internally so that you can actually go outwardly and talk about the benefits and the value of that transformation, hopefully, across your business members and in your community. That was really important for us. So we did a lot of work, just for instance, on the race massacre, and a lot of education and awareness for our board, for our staff, so that at least they would be educated on that. That was our internal look. What questions does that arise? How does that illuminate challenges and disparities we're still seeing today? And that went a long way toward us being able to institute quickly our equity actions with our board and otherwise after that.
Great. And Trisha's just put a question in the chat. What would you recommend for a small chamber in an area that demographically has a very low percentage of minorities? We're in conversations with the newly revamped local NAACP chapter, which is exciting, but I'm very unsure of what first steps make sense in an area that has no racial inclusion or equity initiatives in place at all.
Yeah, and I think that's where, we can talk about race a lot, and I know that I do, but there are a lot of other elements of diversity. And so to think about veterans and how are you encouraging more veteran friendly employers? Are you a veteran friendly organization? Are you making it easier for veterans to transition from service into your workforce, into your chamber? Are you engaging them to give them exposure and opportunity to find work within your membership and your members? Think about ability. Think about the millennials. Are you having a cocktail happy hour, or maybe a Zoom happy hour? You're like, how are you engaging that population? What about your LGBTQ population? So it's not just about race. I don't believe that you have to have a community that's 50-50 in order to do this work. You should just be using the equity lens across all marginalized communities. And I hope that I illuminated at least those 6. Refugee and immigrant, LGBTQ+. There's just a lot of elements of diversity that you can look toward and start trying to measure some of the inequity there and how you can make sure that they're much more engaged. I see my friend Andrea made a comment about young professionals. I love it.
Other questions from the group, either in the chat or raising your hand so you can ask Kuma directly here. Oh, here we go. We have another question. So This person is acknowledging it might be a little bit outside the scope, so we'll just go with that. We had a very recent issue where a city fire captain was arrested for assaulting an Asian man. The incident took place in another community. The city employee has resigned, but the city so far appears to be taking the approach that since he resigned, the issue is going to go away. As a chamber, we would like to use this as an opportunity to promote DEI across the community and how this could be a catalyst for change. So if you have any advice on this, any thoughts on this, just feel free to comment on that. And then I'll also provide your contact information to the person that asked as well.
Yeah, sure. I'll just say that, again, Tulsa, we've had our own challenges with regard to sort of even not unsimilarly police brutality, or maybe Black men dying at the hands of police, really hard conversations with city individuals and our chamber. So what we did was we had a special board meeting. We invited our mayor, we invited our police chief, we invited a pastor, we invited a community member, and we had a really honest panel discussion with those individuals about what are their hopes for our community? How can we do better? How can we align? So it wasn't something that was community broad spread. We invited everyone in. It was just a private meeting with our board, again, providing access for awareness and opportunity for them to sort of co-create solutions with these individuals. And so something like that maybe there's a leader of an Asian organization or an opportunity for you all as a chamber to take the lead and convene a private meeting and be that convener and that facilitator between your organization, the city, the fire department, the Asian community, to have an honest, safe conversation, not anything that you're on the news about, but because you want the business environment to be welcoming, because you want the Asian community to feel welcomed, that you do that in order to facilitate more open dialogue. And I think that is always the role of a chamber, is to create open dialogue and convene people across difference at the table.
Thank you for that. So I have another question here that's about building a task force and asking, what are some of the strategies or best practices to use? Should participants be paid? How do you balance members versus non-members and community partners? What thoughts do you have on that?
Yeah, so the creation of a task force, I love the creation of task forces. I think organizations should do it. I do caution organizations that create something that is ultimately like-minded individuals convening to talk about how they can improve diversity outcomes for an organization. That to me seems like the wrong approach to take. And I believe that D&I, there's a lady here in Tulsa, Sandra Quince, she's an amazing D&I person for Bank of America. She says D&I has to be as embedded in our organizations as safety. And so when you just create a council for just 5 or 12 individuals who believe in it to have conversations about it, you're ultimately preaching to the choir, and you're not making it something that has to be a priority for all individuals who are involved. And so if you're going to create a council, then it needs to be your entire executive team. It needs to be your board executive committee. It needs to be, everyone who's sort of key to the work, and not just those who opt in and care about it. And so in terms of strategies, I would just say, don't segment D&I as this like side thing. Start with everyone at the table as it relates to conversations around diversity. And then just start having, some hard conversations. We call them crucial conversations here in Tulsa, where you're talking about some of the real barriers that you've seen, or you're looking at some of your data and having some of those difficult conversations about what that data is telling you, who's missing from the conversation. And that should be the framework, or your work as a council, on how to start to undo or unwind some of that. So that's the best advice I have. There's a lot of things online related to ERGs, or employee resource groups, and how those are set up and how they operate for organizations. So certainly look into that if you're thinking about creating something like that for your chamber.
Great. We'll wait one more moment to see if there are any other questions. And while we're waiting, I will just give my sincere thanks to Kuma for being here, for spending this time with us, and for all of the great information that you've shared. It has just been so fantastic to have you for both of these sessions, and we really appreciate you being here with our membership. I will give another minute or so for questions, and while we're waiting, just remind everyone that this information will be posted on our website in the webinars section. We'll also include some links to a few of the materials that were referenced here as well. And I know there was a question in the chat about the Tulsa Regional Chamber strategic plan, and whether they might be willing to share that. So we will follow up on that. And if they are willing, then we will go ahead and post that as well with this webinar too.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you so much, Amy. I appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. It's so great to see familiar faces and names out there in the audience. So have a great day.
Well, thank you, everyone.